Welcome to the Telecom Channel. I'm John Tanner, Global Technology Editor for Telecom Asia magazine, published by QuestX. We're at LTE Asia, and I'm speaking with Hâkan Eriksson, Group CTO of Ericsson. Hâkan, welcome to the Telecom Channel.
Thank you.
Now let's start off with asking about what you see as the main drivers for operators to migrate to LTE now, as opposed to waiting a couple of years from now.
Well, I think first of all, maybe migrate seems that you are leaving something and moving to something else. And so I think you are not really migrating. You are sort of, the question is more, I would say, when shall I add LTE to my technology portfolio? And that is dependent on what, of course, your customer base is and so on, and what competition is doing, but maybe even more what are the spectrum that becomes available, and what spectrum do I need to secure for my ongoing business. And it is so, and has been so historically in this business, that certain frequency bands become sort of ecosystems of a certain technology. So the most typical example is the GSM 900 megahertz. It's really been the GSM spectrum around the world. And then 2.1 gigahertz has become the wideband CDMA HSPA spectrum, and now LTE spectrums are opening up, like the 2.6 gigahertz band, the 2.3 gigahertz, and also other bands like maybe reforming of 1800 is becoming an LTE spectrum, and the spectrums that become available at the lower end of the spectrum range from the digital dividend from TV broadcasting going over to digital, the sort of the 6, 7, 800 bands are also becoming LTE bands. So if you decide that, well, for my future business I have to get into those bands, when you get those bands, the technology to deploy is LTE. That doesn't mean that you stop investing in HSPA. It doesn't mean that you give up GSM. You will probably keep GSM on 900 for quite some time for the voice service. You have a big installed base, most likely, of devices on HSPA on 2.1 that you will keep. You will add to portfolio more than migrating.
Okay. Now, usually when we're looking at mobile broadband rollouts, traditionally there's been a focus on urban areas first, and then rural usually comes later in a lot of markets. But we're hearing a lot of talk now about LTE being rolled out in rural areas now in certain markets, which Ericsson has some experience with. How can governments and operators accelerate mobile broadband adoption in rural markets with LTE?
I think, again, coming back to making spectrum available, then it's sort of no real drama in difference between LTE and HSPA when it comes to providing coverage and so on in rural areas. Of course, if you have huge distance between the devices and the base stations, in the uplink you might not be able to get the really high bitrate speeds that LTE can offer. But at the same time, it's not disadvantaged, and maybe it's on the contrary, it's very flexible when it comes to what bandwidth you can use. So make sure that there is spectrum available, and then depending again on which spectrum you make available, that is a spectrum that will be deployed. Then it also depends a bit on what kind of population structure you have in different countries. I mean, some countries are built up with small villages, some are very urbanized and very few people. So it depends also on how people are living in the different countries, how many subscribers you will get through rural deployments from the beginning.
Another hot topic here at the show has been voice over LTE. There's been a lot of talk about that. How important is voice over LTE for operators?
Again, it depends on what other technologies you have. If you have a very strong sort of GSM base, and all your handsets out there already have GSM, and also the devices that come out that are both sort of GSM, HSPA, and LTE, then maybe it's less important. If you, on the other hand, don't have a GSM network and want to migrate away from whatever technology you have and to run the whole service portfolio you have, both data and voice on LTE, then it becomes very important. Then it is called voice over LTE or VoLTE, because it's really in LTE you need it, the true voice over IP for the first time in the 3GPP efficient way of doing it, instead of other, of course, there are other VoIP solutions available that are less efficient, but the VoLTE is a very efficient voice over IP solution that is developed for LTE because you need it, because there is no circuit switch in LTE. Now when you have that, of course, operators are coming back to us and saying, well, now when I have voice over LTE, can I also run that on HSPA? Can I also run that on Wi-Fi? So it becomes first voice over LTE, but then it becomes voice over LTE on HSPA or voice over LTE over Wi-Fi. And then with voice over LTE means really the protocols that are developed for LTE. But it's really a very efficient voice over IP service in the 3GPP family that you can run over any IP access.
During the sessions at the show, some operators were talking about voice over LTE, and they expressed some concerns about LTE needing to have national coverage in order for it to be worthwhile for them to start thinking about voice over LTE. Roaming was also an issue that was brought up as well. Are those valid concerns for operators, do you think?
No, I don't think you need to have it. I mean, if you want to have it as your only service, then of course you need it. But why, you can of course run voice over LTE in LTE coverage areas if you want to stay on the LTE instead of using other parts of the network. So it's not a prerequisite to have nationwide coverage of LTE to run voice over LTE. But of course, if you want to run it as your only voice service, then you need it.
Hâkan Eriksson of Ericsson, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.